But if the manufacturer of your airplane doesn't specify landing data at less than max gross weight, you have one more tool that you can use. And the FAA provided this guidance in their On Landings bulletin, which I mentioned before. I'm going to make available in the show notes, and it's a PDF in my Aviation News Talk app that you can find in the App Store. And this gives guidance as to how much you can reduce landing speed at lower weights. The example they give is that if your aircraft is 20% below gross weight, then you can reduce your landing speed by half of that, or 10%. Hello, and thank you for joining us for episode 85 of the Aviation News Talk podcast, where we talk about general aviation news and safety tips that pilots and student pilots like you can use. Today, we're going to talk in detail about what it takes to make a good short field landing. Plus, this week in the news, the largest and deadliest wildfire in California history has been burning for over 12 days, and we're going to talk about aviation's role in that fire. Plus, the Red Bull races have finished for the year, and there's a winner. And a pilot sleeping in the pilot lounge at an Illinois airport was arrested for loitering. And finally, a clothing-optional airstrip is about to get some recognition. Welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk about general aviation. I'm Max Truscott. I'm here to educate and inform you and hopefully have a little fun. If you're new to the show, I'm a pilot for over 40 years. I wrote the G1000 Glass Cockpit Handbook, and I'm the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year. I specialize in Cirrus aircraft like the SR20, SR22, and now the SF50 Vision Jet. So if you're starting to think about maybe buying one of these aircraft, or you'd like to get some training in one, please call me now for a free consultation and possibly a free demo flight. Now, last week in episode 84, we talked with air traffic controller Brandon Gonzalez about the 10 things pilots do that bug controllers. And later this week on Friday, we'll have a special episode devoted to Black Friday specials and other discounts on aviation-related merchandise. But if you're worried that you won't have time to listen to that episode when you're driving around shopping on Friday, you can still get that Black Friday special list by signing up for the free newsletter. Just go to aviationnewstalk.com, and in the right column, scroll down to where you see free newsletter and then type in your email address. Hopefully you'll get some good gear for yourself, or maybe a nice gift for your favorite flight instructor. All this and more, and the news starts now. From sfchronicle.com, that's the San Francisco Chronicle newspaper, an update on the Camp Fire here in Northern California. It's been burning now for more than 12 days. It scorched over 151,000 acres, according to CAL FIRE. Officials report the blaze is now 66% contained. The fire has incinerated more than 11,700 homes, killed 79 people, and 699 people are still missing. The death toll is expected to get worse, though I can tell you from past fires with hundreds of people reported missing, most of those people ultimately get found. The Camp Fire is now the fourth deadliest natural disaster in California recorded history, behind the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, in which more than 3,000 people died, a 1933 earthquake in Long Beach, and a 1938 flood in Los Angeles. They report that to help suppress the fire, we've been using over 28 helicopters, 597 engines, and numerous air tankers from throughout the state. Some of the postings that were from CHP on Facebook, they have one here that said the California Highway Patrol currently has 6 CHP Rescue Helicopters, 2 from the CHP Golden Gate Division, including CHP airplanes that are involved in rescue operations and evacuations in the Chico area. Multiple CHP helicopters en route to UC Davis Burn Center in Sacramento with patients. Another update from sfgate.com says that CHP had 8 aircraft on the fire within 2 hours to help with the planning of evacuation routes and airlifting of burned patients. They said that CAL FIRE planes don't have cameras and don't fly at night, so CHP performs this kind of interagency support as more large-scale wildfires are now occurring in Northern California. A CHP spokesperson said, "We normally don't fly in fires. It's becoming more frequent for us to do this to support CAL FIRE." CHP airplanes can stay up for about 4 hours at a time, while aircraft can last about 2 hours. The airplanes are equipped with terrain warning systems and also better equipped to fly in low visibility smoke than are the helicopters. Now, I've posted a couple videos related to the Camp Fire on the Patreon page, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on. From sacramento.cbslocal.com comes the story of a crash of an Angel Flight flight. Now, normally I don't talk about plane crashes. This is significant because Angel Flight has now had 2 crashes that were fatal in 2 months here in Northern California. September crash in Palo Alto killed a pilot from Placerville at my home airport. And then this past Thursday, a crash in Redding killed a pilot from El Dorado Hills and a nurse named Clay Abajan of Sacramento State. Abajan was volunteering as a mission assistant with Angel Flight last Thursday. He and the volunteer pilot had landed at Redding Airport in Northern California, dropped off 2 passengers, and were on their way back to Sacramento when the accident happened, killing the 2. According to the FAA incident report, the plane collided with terrain due to unknown circumstances. CBS 13 reached out to the president of Angel Flight West. He declined an interview, but says the organization is continuing to emphasize safety with its volunteers. It's also noteworthy that there was a crash back east with Angel Flight East in New Jersey back in June. In that case, a small plane that crashed in New Jersey shortly after takeoff was headed to Massachusetts to pick up a medical patient. 2 people were on board that plane when it crashed, and both were killed. That was also in Angel Flight. Moving along to some happier news. This comes from FAI.org, the Federic Aviation International. It monitors all aviation records. Martin Sanka wins the 2018 Red Bull Air Race. Martin Sanka has won the 2018 Red Bull Air Race World Championship following the final race in Fort Worth, Texas this past weekend. The pressure could not have been higher for the Czech pilot, who was last to fly and had to win the race to win the overall championship. And my recollection, by the way, is that they have 8 races around the world that make up the overall championship. This was the final one for the year. He said this race was incredible. It couldn't end up better than this. It was a beautiful race with everything in it. Sanka was one of the favorites to win, but as he entered the final leg of the 2018 Red Bull Air Race, the point spread meant that any one of the 3 pilots could win and take the World Championship title. Matt Hall of Australia and Michael Julianne of the U.S. were both still in it down to the wire with a chance to win. Hall flew first, flying a perfect round, clean and fast, and the crowd cheering as he scored a fast-track record of 53.1 seconds. Minutes later, Sanka flew through the checkered flag start gates to start his round. 2 perfect laps followed, with Sanka gaining ground in the crucial turn around gate 7. Seconds later, he flew back through the start-finish gate to win the race and the title, just 0.2 seconds faster than Australian Hall. Sanka is a former Czech Air Force fighter pilot with a strong background in aerobatics, particularly freestyle aerobatics. He's been flying the Red Bull Air Race for 5 seasons and placed second in 2017. Looking at U.S. pilots, Michael Julianne earned the 3rd spot overall among the 14 masterclass pilots in the season, while Kirby Chambliss was 3rd at the Fort Worth race. He ended up in 6th place overall. Julianne had a tough day on the course and finished 8th in the race, but his previous victories and finishes during the season were enough for him to hang on to a top 3 overall finish. And again, overall, worldwide, the winners for the entire championship, Martin Sanka, number 1, Matt Hall of Australia, number 2, Michael Julianne of the U.S., number 3. Congratulations to all of them. And from Flying Magazine at flyingmag.com, authorities investigating a Las Vegas tower controller incapacitation. Authorities are currently investigating why a female air traffic controller at Las Vegas McCarran Airport became incapacitated and unable to direct traffic last week. According to audio recordings uploaded to the internet, as well as reporting from the Associated Press, the controller can be heard mumbling and making mistakes and reading call signs and later coughing. Pilots voiced concern on the tower frequency and communicated between themselves to maintain safe traffic movement, though no loss of separation between aircraft was reported. Another controller, who had been on a break, eventually took control of the frequency as paramedics responded. Before she became unable to manage the traffic, the controller worked for just over an hour and spoke to 29 aircraft. As a result of the event, 2 controllers are now required to be in the tower during busy hours. And here's a follow-up from the Reno Gazette-Journal. It says that an air traffic controller who became incapacitated on a night shift last week has quit. The FAA said in a statement Tuesday the unidentified controller was no longer employed by the agency. An aide to Democratic Congresswoman Dina Titus of Las Vegas says the controller resigned on Sunday. Officials have not said what caused the controller to slur her words and become incapacitated. From law.justia.com, a lawsuit brought by a pilot who was originally arrested in an airport pilot lounge has been dismissed by an appellate court. The story all began back in July 2015 at 4:30 a.m. in the morning when Eric Erickson was sleeping in the pilot's lounge, which is always open, at the Rochelle Municipal Airport in Ogle County, Illinois. A man walked into the lounge and awakened Erickson and asked that Erickson provide identification. Erickson refused to answer because the man did not identify himself. Unknown to Erickson, he was Philip Frankenberry, a police officer employed by the city of Rochelle. Another unidentified man then entered the lounge and blocked the exit. Erickson would later learn that the second man was Aaron Rodenbaugh, also a police officer. Both men repeatedly told Erickson to identify himself, but Erickson remained defiantly silent. They ultimately arrested him on charges that he resisted an obstruction, one who was known to the person to be a peace officer, and searched his belongings. He was then transported to jail where a sheriff's deputy detained him based on the arrest until he was bonded out the next day. State prosecutors charged him with both obstructing and resisting a police officer. They later voluntarily dropped the obstruction charge, and the judge granted Erickson's motion to dismiss the other charge. Erickson subsequently brought a lawsuit against both police officers and various other parties, and that suit was ultimately dismissed. And if you're curious, it turns out that in the state of Illinois, you are not required to show identification, but you can be required to identify yourself only if the police reasonably suspect that you are in the process of committing a crime or have committed a crime. And if you're in a public place and the police think you are part of a crime and they tell you that they are the police. From GeneralAviationNews.com comes the word that the General Aviation Awards deadline is fast approaching. Each year for more than 50 years, the General Aviation Awards program and the FAA have recognized aviation professionals for their contributions to general aviation in the fields of flight instruction, aviation maintenance, and safety. And the three national winners, well, they all receive an expense-paid trip to the EAA AirVenture in Oshkosh, where they're recognized by the FAA administrator and other high-ranking FAA officials. Will have their names added to a large plaque in the EAA Museum and will be feted at an awards luncheon where they will receive gifts donated by the GAA industry sponsors. But people need to act fast if you want to be a part of this. The deadline for submitting nominations and applications for the 2019 General Aviation Awards is November 30th, 2018. And you can find complete details of how to create an application packet at generalaviationawards.com/nominations, and I'll include a link to that in our show notes. In international news, this also comes to us from GeneralAviationNews.com. Disabled pilots to fly around the world in a flight design CTLS, which happens to be one of my favorite light sport aircraft. A daring adventure by physically challenged pilots to fly around the world is set to take off on November 18th, 2018. Handy flight pilots Paolo Pacobelli, Jaume Farral, and Mike Lomberg, flying the flight design CTLS, will lead an international team of more than 15 pilots with physical disabilities on the world flight. The flight, which starts in Geneva, Switzerland, will visit 40 countries, 5 continents, travel more than 49,000 miles, and include 150 stops to meet, share, inspire, and promote the inclusion of disabled people worldwide. Handy Flight is a nonprofit association formed in Gruyere, Switzerland in 2007. It's become the biggest fly-in for disabled pilots around the world. After 10 years of successful events, Handy Flight is tackling a new goal, quote, to fly around the world to explore new horizons, look for new challenges, combat prejudices, and promote the inclusion of disabled people. The goal is to raise funds for Handicap International, according to organizers. According to flight design CEO Lars Jorges, the German company is a contributing sponsor to the world flight. Upon completion of the flight, it will mark the third around-the-world flight for a CT series aircraft, according to flight design officials. And we wish all these pilots well in their around-the-world journey. And also in international news, this comes from MexicoNewsDaily.com, and please bear with me, I'll probably mispronounce many of these names. It says that a Mexican company is holding talks with the Guanajuato government with a view to building an aviation complex in that state that will design and assemble planes as well as train pilots. Now, just to give you some background, Guanajuato is a state that's about 100 miles north and west of Mexico City and east of Guadalajara. It says the IK Aerospace Group, made up of light aircraft manufacturer Horizon Tech, aircraft interior manufacturer Ciasa Air, and aerospace software company Optimum, told the newspaper Milenio that the new complex could be built in one of 3 Guanajuato municipalities, either León, San Miguel de Allende, or Purisma de Rincon. Construction of the facility, which will be the first of its kind in Mexico, would require about 100 hectare acres of land. They explained the idea for the project is to have a private runway, a manufacturing plant, an aircraft maintenance center, and a flying school for pilots that could include future customers who purchase light planes manufactured at the new complex. Horizon Tech, currently based at Puerto International Airport, is developing a new 2-seat plane after building and testing a prototype made of compressed wood and fiberglass last year. That aircraft measures about 7 meters in length with a wingspan of 9.4 meters. It's a two-seater, 100-horsepower engine aircraft that belongs to the light sport category. It'll have a flight range of 8 hours, an average top speed of 250 to 300 kilometers per hour, and can reach an altitude of 15,000 feet. And finally, from avweb.com comes a story that the chicken strip is to be legalized. According to Wikipedia, the chicken strip is a non-towered dirt airstrip that's not depicted on an FAA sectional chart. And according to AvWeb, it's possibly the country's only clothing-optional airstrip. And they say it's about to be officially recognized by the National Park Service, and that the Recreational Aviation Foundation is urging members to let the NPS know they support the initiative. The Saline Valley Warm Springs Airfield, better known as the Chicken Strip, is located adjacent to an abundant natural hot springs in Death Valley National Park, California. Many visitors don't worry about fashion of any kind while camping there. Like all the other facilities at the springs, the strip was created by those who frequent the area, and the NPS has issued a notice of proposed rulemaking that legalizes its existence and formalizes its deal with the RAF to maintain it. Comments close at midnight November 19th and can be submitted online. Now, the NPS seems pretty enthusiastic about keeping the airstrip, which is about 1,400 feet long and 35 feet wide. Quote, retaining use of the airstrip would benefit visitor use and experience for those visitors who seek this type of recreation or those visitors who enjoy watching the aircraft fly into the Warm Springs area, according to the NPRM. For some visitors with injuries or disabilities and who have access to small planes, the Chicken Strip airstrip is the only way they can access the Warm Springs area because the drive is too long and harsh for them. The only other way to the area is a bone-crushing 4-hour drive on a rutted road. Well, that's the news for this week. Coming up, we're going to be talking about the secrets to making a great short field landing. Plus, a listener who's on medication for clinical depression and anxiety asked just what is the process for getting an FAA medical so that he can take flight training. Stick around. We'll be right back here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And welcome back. Before we get to short field landings, let me give you a few quick updates. I'm sure most of you know I'm just back from Australia, my first trip there, and I had a fabulous time down at the Cirrus Pilot Proficiency Program, flying with pilots there and trying to share information about how best to fly Cirrus aircraft. I want to thank the many listeners who gave me suggestions on what to do while I was in Australia. Let me go ahead and read something here from Mark Newton, who actually flew up to Orange to say hello. He suggested while I was in Orange that I take a night flight, and this kind of explains why he thought that would be interesting. And just as background, I learned that the entire continent of Australia is roughly comparable in size to the lower 48 states here in the United States. So it's really huge, though it has just a fraction of our population. I think there's about 23 million people in Australia. In the same area here in the United States, we have about 330 million people. Mark wrote, virtually all of Australia's population lives within an hour's drive of a beach. More than 90% of the country is concentrated into a very thin band that starts a little bit north of Brisbane and stretches around the coast to Melbourne. If you add the medium-sized cities of Adelaide and Perth to that band, you get to about 97% of the population, which means hardly anyone lives in the interior. There are towns usually more than an hour's drive apart, but even they get sparser and smaller as you go further inland. The only inland town bigger than about 5,000 people northwest of Forbes is Alice Springs, and the last 350 nautical miles of flight to Alice Springs and a Cirrus will overfly no towns or roads whatsoever. So if you take a night flight at Orange and turn west, you'll immediately notice that there is essentially no ground light at all, and you will not discern a horizon. Unless you're flying over the well-lit, densely populated areas of the eastern seaboard, the en route portion of the night cross-country flight in Australia is essentially IMC. And that's why our basic private license are all day VFR only, and why we have a separate night VFR rating. By the way, the same is true for Canada, which is probably similar in some regards in terms of being far more sparsely populated and having large regions with no lights. So thanks for sharing that information, Mark. And just to tell you a little bit about the trip itself, I left San Francisco at about 5:30 on a Wednesday, and I arrived in Sydney, Australia at about 7 a.m. on Friday. It was a 14-hour flight plus 1 day since we crossed the international date line. I slept reasonably well in the flight. And I then picked up John Fiskus. He's a flight instructor from the Flight Academy, which is based up in Seattle. And together we drove the 4+ hours out to Orange, which is where the Cirrus Pilot Proficiency Program was going to be held that weekend. Got to tell you, the one thing I would change about Australia is the roundabouts. You folks have way too many roundabouts. We hardly have any in the U.S., and when we do, they go the other way. So that was probably the most confusing thing about driving, was having to enter these things clockwise and turn left, but look to the right to make sure somebody wasn't coming to hit you. Anyway, we got there safely, and I will say that during the entire time I was driving in Australia, cars only honked at me twice. I guess that's a pretty good record. Now, after we got there, we had some downtime, so I went for a walk around the town just to see it. And as I was walking, there was a gentleman who had just parked his car, and he got out, and I could see he was going to say something to me. And so I stopped to talk with him. And the first thing he said was that, hey, I'm foreign to the Orange area. And then he asked me if the angled parking that they required in the city had been done by him properly. So I started to tell him I thought he'd done a fine job. And we started laughing almost immediately, because it was pretty obvious that I was even more foreign to Orange than he was. So that was my first conversation really with an Australian after I arrived there. Pretty funny that he took me to be a local. Well, we had a very busy weekend flying. I flew with 4 different people and 4 different Cirrus aircraft, great pilots down there. Now, one of the things that was ever so slightly different was listening to what we would call the ATIS or the AWOS here in the United States. They call the AWIS, and they call it the AWIS. And I've got a recording here from Orange, the Orange AWIS. And what you're going to hear when you listen to it is, first of all, the accent's a little bit different than we have here in the United States. When they give the winds, they include the word magnetic. They also give the humidity. Here we would say altimeter 2992. There they're going to say QNH and then give the number in hectopascals. So take a listen. I had to do a little bit of noise reduction on this, but this is the best I could get from my recording. And by the way, the first thing he gives is the name of the town, Orange.
Orange, AWS Aerodrome Weather. Wind 320 degrees magnetic, 7 knots. QNH 1022 hectopascals. Temperature 21. Cloud clear below 2,000 feet. Visibility 10 kilometers. Dew point 2. Humidity 29%. Rainfall last 10 minutes, nil.
And you may have noticed that they gave visibility in kilometers, and also they had relative humidity, something I've never heard on an AWOS here in the United States. A very handy piece of information to have. A lot of people have asked me what was different about flying in Australia. First, I'll tell you that the sights were beautiful. I really enjoyed flying out there. The landscape out near Orange kind of reminded me of being somewhere in the Appalachian Mountains in the United States, perhaps, down Tennessee area, similar kinds of hills and so on. So that was definitely kind of fun to watch the world go by. The one difference I noticed is that all 4 pilots I flew with, I think every one of them was listening to 2 frequencies simultaneously for almost the entire flight. That's a little different than what I see here in the United States. Usually folks will have either, the CTAF on or the approach control frequency. In this case, they had the CTAF on for usually Orange, and they were also listening to what they called the area frequency for Sydney, which would be our approach control frequency. I think there are definitely times when it's handy to have both on, but I was surprised that most of the pilots had both on the entire time that we were flying. So that was the one big difference I saw. The other one, which was kind of an anomaly, was when we were on the CTAF frequency for Orange, at the end of every transmission, there was a beep that lasted for almost a second, which I found pretty annoying after a while, especially because I was tired. And when I'm tired, I find that little things like that grate on me a little bit. I asked every single pilot I flew with, what is that? And nobody knew what it was. So it tells me that must be something local to Orange. So I'm guessing they must have some little device there which monitors the CTAF frequency. And every time it detects a transmission ending, it puts out a beep. And I'm guessing it transmits that beep to kind of let other people know, hey, that transmission's been finished. So anyway, if anybody knows for sure what that is, let me know, because that was quite different. Anyway, the facilities were fantastic. We were hosted by the Aero Club of Orange. I'll talk more in a future issue about aero clubs, quite different than the very few aero clubs we have here in the United States. but they are a major part of the infrastructure for general aviation in Australia. And I want to especially thank all of the many people who wrote with ideas as to things I should do on the 4 extra days that I had off while I was there. So folks like Darby Tinker, Jeffrey Niemeyer, Trevor Moody, let's see who else here, Patrick Pullis, Anthony Crichton Brown, Brett Kay, Chris Raymond, and probably some others that I missed, all had great ideas on places to stay. What I did do was, after I was at Orange, I drove back with John to Sydney, spent 2 nights there with a customer of mine here from the United States, Jim Barrett, and his wife, Sandy. They graciously used their points to provide me with a very nice hotel for 2 nights that they were staying at in the downtown area. We spent all day Monday riding the ferries, which was great fun. It was just beautiful, and then walking around the city as well. Tuesday, I did an interview that we'll bring to you here in a future episode. And then on Tuesday night, I drove down to Bateman's Bay, which is about 4 hours south. And that was just kind of a nice, quiet place to spend 2 days. It was a little rainy, and the temperatures were down just below 60 degrees Fahrenheit, which was perfect. My kind of weather made me feel like I was at home. Gave me a little bit of time for R&R to also do some writing as well before I drove back to Sydney and flew back home. So all in all, a fantastic trip, and we'll be talking more about Australia in the future. By the way, I want to thank the 4 Cirrus pilots there that I flew with. First was Antoine Nahanakam, and he's one of our Patreon sponsors. He's also partially responsible for the large attendance we had down there. He sent out a lot of emails and got a lot of folks to come. We had about 85 people from Australia, almost all Cirrus pilots, show up for the event. And to put that in perspective, that's a larger gathering than at any of the comparable events I've ever been to here in the United States. So great job, Antoine, in getting the troops to come out. Also want to thank Pierce Bowman, who I flew with. Let's see, Huey Tan, who's a doctor from the western part of Australia. I think he flew about 10 hours to get there. And also Rob Payne. So thanks so much. I had a great time flying with all of you. And I got to say, I really enjoyed my visit there. I know I'm going to come back. And it was just some of the nicest, warmest people I've ever met anywhere. Made me feel very welcome. And all I can say is, if I ever decide to move permanently from the United States, I think Australia will be top on my list there. So great trip. And now that I'm back, I can tell you that the air quality here in the San Francisco Bay Area is horrendous. The fire started at the campfire near Paradise, California, the day after I left for Australia. And that's about 150 miles away from us as the crow flies. I monitored the visibility at my home airport, Palo Alto, while I was gone. And it was hovering around 4 miles for a number of days, then went down to 3 miles of visibility. When I arrived home, it was 2 miles of visibility, and it got even worse down to about 1.5 miles. So over the last 4 days, I have canceled all the flights that I've had. It's just too unhealthy to be out there. Sure, we could fly IFR, but, why spend the time outdoors, pre-flying an aircraft in that kind of, disgusting environment. In San Francisco, they said that they have readings that are 60 times higher than the threshold set by the World Health Organization for healthy air. They said that it's the equivalent, if you're walking around out there, of smoking 10 cigarettes a day. The other thing I discovered was there's an interesting resource available online if you want to know more about air quality, and that's at purpleair.com. Now, this is a company which sells an air monitoring sensor, and they've set it up so that people who buy it can connect it to a network, and that network is then displayed on a map. And if you look at the map of the United States, you can see that Northern California is covered in red and dark purple, which is extremely unhealthy air. Now, we are told that within a day or two, we should finally get some rain, and that should hopefully clear out a lot of the smoke, and hopefully it will also slow down the fires, which at this point are about 65% contained. And speaking of the fires out on the Patreon site this week, I posted a couple of videos that you probably haven't seen elsewhere. One shows the DC-10 and the 747 super tankers being reloaded to fight fires here in California. That was at the McClellan Air Force Base, and the gentleman who shot that video was up very close, and so you can see all the details of both of those aircraft and learn a lot more about how they're being used to fight the fires. And also included footage from the California Highway Patrol. They shot some infrared footage from one of their aircraft of the campfire, so you can take a look and see what that looks like as well. Speaking of the Patreon flight, if after you listen to the show you're looking for just a little bit more, you can always go out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. Click on the word posts on that tab, and then you can see all of my posts there. Most of them are free. And of course, while you're there, if you'd like to go ahead and support us by sending us a few dollars a month, you can do that as well, just like these people. For example, Andrew Donahue just added his pledge up to $8 a month. Preston Root is a new supporter, as is Robert Luton. Peter Alberti is one of our super supporters. Thank you very much, Peter. And Eric Hazen has also joined us as well. So I'd like to thank all of these new supporters and thank everybody who supports the show in any way, whether you give us a review on one of the podcast platforms, whether you're sending us feedback, sending us listener questions, or just sending me email. Thanks so much. Greatly appreciate your support for the show. Now, in a moment, we're going to talk about how to make great short field landings right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. Let's talk now about 2 secrets for making great short field landings. Now, if the truth be told, these apply to all kinds of landings. It's just that they're a little bit more critical when you're doing short field landings. Now, I started thinking about this while I was in Australia last week flying with 4 different Cirrus pilots. I only recall asking one of the pilots to do a short field landing, and he absolutely nailed it. It was perfect. But I noticed that some of the pilots were a little imprecise with their landing speed when making normal landings. And when I see that, it usually tells me the pilot is based at an airport with a relatively long runway, so that his or her airspeed on final is less critical. Because if you're landing on a long runway, then you're fast, well, it just means that you're going to float longer before you touch down. And if your home airport's at a long runway, then you start to get into the habit of that. Now, I come from a totally different viewpoint, since I'm based in an airport with just one runway, and it's a little less than 2,500 feet long. And that's generally plenty of runway for most GA aircraft flown at the proper speed, but it's a little tight for a Cirrus pilot who's 5 knots fast and landing with calm winds. So proper short field landing technique is something that I drill with my clients every day on every single landing back into our home field. Now let's talk a little bit about what does an extra 5 knots do to your landing distance. Now this information comes from an FAA safety bulletin called On Landings, and it's divided into 3 different documents, Part 1, Part 2, and Part 3. And I'll put links to these documents in the show notes. And if you have the free Aviation News Talk podcast app that you can find in the Apple App Store and the Google Play Store by just searching for Aviation News Talk, you'll find these documents already in the app under the PDF tab. Now, according to On Landings, if you carry too much airspeed at the moment of touchdown, your rollout distance will increase by the square of the ratio of your actual touchdown speed over your normal touchdown speed. So here's an example. If an airplane that should be landed at 50 knots touches down instead at 55 knots, it's 10% faster, or a factor of 1.1. So the ground rollout distance will increase by the square of that factor. If you square 1.1, you get 1.21. So the distance from where you touch down to where you finally stop is going to be 21% greater than for the minimum touchdown speed. Now, this could be plenty of reason to just go around if you land that long. But get this, if you, for example, flew that same approach at 70 knots or 20 knots faster than your normal approach speed, that's going to require 96% more rollout distance, or nearly double the runway for that type of landing. So now, getting back to short field landings, pilots, of course, are required to perform them on both the private and the commercial check rides. So let's first talk about the criteria that pilots have to meet in order to pass the check ride. The ACS is a document that specifies check ride criteria, and I'm going to go through the full list of items a pilot has to do for a short field landing on a private check ride. But first, let me skip to the most important one. The pilot must, quote, touch down at a proper pitch attitude, in other words, not flat. And by the way, that's a recent change, so you can no longer just kind of force the aircraft and bang it down flat onto the runway. It also says that besides touching down at the proper pitch attitude, it must be done within 200 feet beyond or on the specified point, threshold marking, or runway numbers with no side drift, minimum float, and with the aircraft's longitudinal axis aligned with and over the runway centerline. Now, for the commercial check ride, the criteria is 100 feet beyond the specified point, so that's pretty precise. Now, notice I said beyond the specified point, not beyond the beginning of the runway. When you're practicing a short field landing, you never want to use the beginning of the runway as your target landing spot. Now, there's a really good reason for that, because if you come up short, you're going to end up on the dirt before the runway, and depending upon your airfield, you could end up damaging the airplane. So whenever you're practicing short field landings or performing on a check ride, we always pick some point on the runway, for example, the numbers, or maybe the second centerline strip beyond the numbers, or whatever point you and your flight instructor or the examiner agree upon. And that becomes your specified point, which simulates the beginning of the runway. That way, if you come up short while you're practicing, well, you're still on the runway and you won't damage the aircraft. So you might ask, how do I know if I touch down within 200 feet of the specified point? Now, I used to count for about 2.5 seconds after a touchdown point. I would go 1,001, 1,002, 1,000, and I would know that I was probably averaging the flare about maybe 60 miles an hour in a Cessna, and that speed one's going to travel at 88 feet per second at 60 miles an hour. So 2.5 seconds, that's just over 200 feet. But a couple of years ago, I learned an even more accurate way to measure 200 feet, which is really easy. Turns out that in the U.S., the FAA has a standard for the length of each of the stripes that runs down the length of the runway, as well as a length for the space or the gap between stripes. Now, one stripe plus one space is exactly 200 feet. So if you agree upon a touchdown point that's at the beginning of the stripe, you can't touch down before the stripe, and you must touch down before the beginning of the next stripe. Now, by the way, the stripe itself is 120 feet long, which is a little longer than the 100 feet tolerance for a short field landing on the commercial check ride. So let's go ahead and talk about the full criteria for a short field landing as it appears in the ACS for the private check ride. And I think you're really going to be surprised at how many factors a private pilot is required to be knowledgeable about when performing a short field landing. First, the ACS states the objective is to determine that the applicant exhibits satisfactory knowledge, risk management, and skills associated with a short field approach and landing, with emphasis on proper use and coordination of flight controls. Under the knowledge section, it says the applicant demonstrates the understanding of 1, a stabilized approach to include energy management concepts. And of course, we've talked a lot about stable approaches. Go back to episode 27 if you'd like to review that. Number 2 under knowledge is effects of atmospheric conditions, including wind on approach and landing performance. And 3, wind correction techniques on approach and landing. Under risk management for short field landings, it says the applicant demonstrates the ability to identify, assess, and mitigate risk encompassing 1, selection of runway based on pilot capability, airplane performance and limitations, available distance and wind. 2, effects of A, crosswind, B, wind shear, C, tailwind, D, wake turbulence, E, runway surface and condition. 3, planning for A, go around and rejected landings, B, landing and hold short operations. That would be lasso. And of course, that would be when you're landing to runways that cross each other and another aircraft is landing on the other runway at the same time. Number 4, collision hazards to include aircraft, vehicles, persons, wildlife, terrain, obstacles, and wires. 5, low altitude maneuvering, including stall, spin, or CFIT, which of course is controlled flight into terrain. 6, distractions, loss of situational awareness, and or improper task management. And then under skills, the applicant demonstrates the ability to 1, complete the appropriate checklist, 2, make radio calls as appropriate, 3, ensure the airplane is aligned with the correct assigned runway, 4, scan the landing runway and adjoining area for traffic and obstructions, 5, consider the wind conditions, landing surface, obstructions, and select a suitable touchdown point. 6, establish the recommended approach and landing configuration and airspeed and adjust pitch attitude and power as required to maintain a stabilized approach. 7, maintain manufacturer's published speed or in the absence of it not more than 1.3 VSO, and to do that plus and minus 10 knots. And maintaining airspeed plus 10, minus 5 knots is really important to getting not only a good landing, but also because an examiner can very easily verify whether or not you're doing that properly. Number 8, maintain crosswind correction and directional control throughout the approach and landing. 9, make smooth, timely, and correct control applications during the round out and touchdown. 10, touchdown at a proper pitch attitude within 200 feet beyond or on the specified point, threshold markings, or runway numbers with no side drift, minimum float, and with the airplane's longitudinal axis aligned with and over the runway center line. 11. Use manufacturer's recommended procedures for airplane configuration and braking. 12. Execute a timely go-around if the approach cannot be made within the tolerances specified above or for any other conditions that may result in an unsafe approach or landing. And 13. Utilize runway incursion avoidance procedures. And that, of course, is just one of the many landing types and maneuvers that a pilot has to perform on the private check ride. Now, I would argue that there are really just two secrets to making a good short-field landing. And you probably already know them, but I'll tell you that I see pilots forget one of them all the time. Number one, fly the short field approach speed for your airplane. Now, this is something that pilots usually remember, that they're supposed to fly a different speed for a short field landing. Number two, choose an appropriate aiming point, which is not the point where you intend to touch down. We'll talk more about both of these in a moment. But first, let's go to the FAA's Airplane Flying Handbook to pick out a few things it has to say about how to fly short field approaches. It starts out by saying that, quote, short field approaches and landings require the use of procedures for approaches and landings at fields with relatively short landing areas or where an approach is made over obstacles that limit the available landing area. So what they're really telling us is, hey, we have two very different types of situations where you need to use this one short field landing technique. Now, one, it's pretty obvious that when you're doing the ACS, the first situation is really what people are testing for, which is the short runway. But they're saying that this same technique, this short field landing, is equally appropriate for when you have a high obstacle on short final. Now, I'd like to argue for a moment that these two different kinds of situations, a short runway and a high obstacle on final, really require two different types of landing techniques and not just a one-size-fits-all short-field landing technique. Now, here's why I say that. The best predictor of a good landing is a stabilized approach. And for a short runway, you can easily do a stabilized approach. But for a runway with an obstacle on short final, all the books are going to suggest that you're going to want to have a steeper angle of descent as you pass over that obstacle. And the only way to get a steeper angle of descent while flying at the correct short field landing approach speed is to use less power, which gives you a higher descent rate. Now, if you have a higher than normal descent rate, then you're going to have less time to round out in the flare, which means you're going to have to judge the round out maneuver more carefully, and there's going to be less margin for error. And that error could be hitting the runway hard and damaging the airplane. So simulating an obstacle and flying at a high descent rate over that obstacle moves us from a stabilized approach to an unstabilized approach. So yes, if you're willing to do unstable approaches for all of your short field landings, then yes, you could use just one technique, which would be to always come in at a steep angle along with its high descent rate for all of your short field landings, even if you don't have any obstacles on short final. Which, frankly, I think is ridiculous. Given the choice, why wouldn't you land with a stabilized approach whenever you could, even when you're doing short field landings? Now, here's an interesting accident that occurred in Virginia in December 2016 in a Piper Meridian. The NTSB report says the pilot receiving instruction reported that during an annual insurance flight review, he was told to perform a short field landing for the final landing. The flight instructor told him to be, quote, 50 feet over the numbers at 75 knots indicated airspeed, then go to flight idle, which pull the throttle to zero, essentially is what that means, push the nose down and land short. On short final, the pilot obtained the target altitude and airspeed, then reduced the power to flight idle, and the airplane dropped rapidly. He advanced the power lever, but the turbine-powered engine was slow to respond due to the spool-up lag, and the airplane landed hard and bounced. The pilot reported that they taxied back to the hangar and no further incident. The plane sustained substantial damage to the fuselage. Now, it turns out that the POH for the Piper Meridian tells you to do exactly that. Now, my guess is that the pilot got slow, which is why the airplane dropped rapidly. And that can happen when you pull the power at 50 feet if you also start to raise the nose for your round out and flare. Now, if I'm that high when I pull power, I'll leave the nose down for a few seconds or maybe even lower it even more, just briefly, so that the aircraft doesn't get slow. But regardless, why would you want to create an unstable approach by simulating a 50-foot obstacle when many short runways don't have obstacles? Why not just land in a stable approach at a normal descent angle? So going back to the Airplane Flying Handbook, they say this low-speed type of power-on approach, I'm talking, of course, here about short-field landings, is closely related to the performance of flight at minimal controllable airspeeds, or that's what most pilots would call slow flight. It continues, to land within a short field, the pilot must have precise, positive control over the rate of descent and airspeed to produce an approach that clears any obstacles, results in little or no floating during the roundout, and permit the airplane to be stopped in the shortest possible distance. The procedures for landing in a short field or for landing approaches over obstacles as recommended in the AFM POH should be used. A stabilized approach is essential. These procedures generally involve the use of full flaps and the final approach speed stated from an altitude of at least 500 feet higher than the touchdown area. Now, here's one point I would like to argue. The Airplane Flying Handbook also says a wider than normal pattern is normally used so that the airplane can be properly configured and trimmed. Now, if by wider than normal they mean a downwind that's further from the runway, I disagree. If, on the other hand, by wider than normal they mean a longer downwind resulting in a longer final, well, that makes a lot more sense to me than a wider downwind. A long final does give you more time to slow your final approach speed and get properly trimmed. By contrast, a wider pattern just gives you a longer base, which isn't of much help since you're not at your final approach speed on base, and hence you just can't slow down and trim to your final approach speed. Now, a lot of POHs specify a short field approach speed. For example, the Cessna 172 short field speed is 60, 61, or 62 knots, depending upon the model year. And I think the older ones with 40 degrees of flaps had a 55 knot short landing speed, though I might be remembering that incorrectly. The most recent model, the SR20, has a short field approach speed of 79 knots. Older SR22s have a short field approach speed of 77 knots. But if the POH for your airplane doesn't specify a short field landing speed, the Airplane Flying Handbook tells us that, quote, in the absence of the manufacturer's recommended approach speed, a speed of not more than 1.3 VSO is used. Now, VSO, of course, would be stall speed when the airplane's in a landing configuration. Continues, for example, in an airplane that stalls at 60 knots with power off and flaps and landing gear extended, and an approach speed no higher than 78 knots is used. In gusty air, no more than 1/2 the gust factor is added. An excessive amount of airspeed could result in a touchdown too far from the runway threshold or an after landing roll that exceeds the available landing area. And I would agree, speed is critical. If you're too fast, your landing distance will increase. Now, they also say in gusty air, add no more than 1/2 the gust factor. And what that means is that the winds are varying in strength or gusting, you want to increase your airspeed above the recommended short field landing speed. Now, the gust factor, that's the difference between the steady wind and the maximum wind. So, for example, if the winds at your airport are reported as being 300 at 15 gusting to 25 knots, the 300 means the winds are coming from the northwest on a compass heading of 300. The steady state wind is 15 knots, and the peak wind is 25 knots. And the gust factor, well, that's the difference between the steady state and the maximum wind. So in this case, 25 minus 15 knots is 10 knots, which is the gust factor in this example. Then the Airplane Flying Handbook tells us to take half of the gust factor, so half of 10 is 5 knots, and add that number to our final approach speed. So if we normally land on a short field at 65 knots and the wind is 15 gusting to 25, we're going to add half the gust factor, or 5 knots, to the 65, and we'll land at 70 knots instead. And of course, this is true for all types of landings you would be doing where you've got gusty winds, not just short field landings. But are there other ways that you can reduce your landing speed and shorten your landing distance even more? Well, the answer is, in some cases, yes. To know whether you can do that, you need to first look at the landing charts in the performance section. Now, that's section 5 of the POH or AFM for your aircraft. Most performance charts specify that the data given is valid when the aircraft is at the maximum gross weight. And for some manufacturers, well, that's all you're going to find is max gross weight data. But some manufacturers provide landing data not just at max gross weight, but also at a number of different lower weights. And if you examine these charts carefully, you'll often find a lower short field approach speed for each of these lower weights. If you have data like that for your airplane and you're flying at less than max gross weight, then just adjust your short field landing speed to the speed specified for your current weight. But if the manufacturer of your airplane doesn't specify landing data at less than max gross weight, you have one more tool that you can use. And the FAA provided this guidance in their On Landings bulletin, which I mentioned before. I'm going to make available in the show notes, and it's a PDF in my Aviation News Talk app that you can find in the App Store. And this gives guidance as to how much you can reduce landing speed at lower weights. The example they give is that if your aircraft is 20% below gross weight, then you can reduce your landing speed by half of that, or 10%. So if your short field landing speed in your POH is 60 knots at max gross weight and you're 10% below gross weight, you can reduce your speed by 5% or 3 knots, giving you a short field approach speed of 57 knots. Again, from On Landings, it says when making these kinds of calculations, you must use the calibrated airspeed values that are published in your handbook. That's because calibrated airspeed is indicated airspeed, which you'd read on your airspeed indicator, corrected for position and instrument errors. They say calibrated airspeed should always be used to calculate the proper approach speed at any landing weight and then converted back to the indicated airspeed that you're going to be using. You should do this because they say for some airplanes, the indicated airspeed near the stall speed has a very significant error. And this is how you can estimate the approach speed for airplanes that do not provide approach speeds as a function of reduced landing weight. So back in the example we gave before where we were converting from 60 knots, that should be at calibrated airspeed. And then at the 57 knots, you would then go into your correction tables to find what indicated airspeed would be equivalent to the 57 knots calibrated into airspeed. And in that part of the chart, I think generally the indicated airspeed is going to tend to be a few knots lower than the calibrated airspeed. And that's because the pitot tube is going to be pitched up at an angle. The air entering it's not going to be coming straight in, so it's going to be reading lower than it should read. But here's a warning from On Landings when calculating your own approach speeds. It says the manufacturer may require a particular approach speed at all weights because during certification flight testing, it was found that for stability and control reasons or for go-around safety, a fixed speed is required. So it says you want to check this for your airplane before you start trying to calculate different speeds based on lower weights. So flying at the appropriate short field landing speed, well, that's the first secret of making a good short field landing. The second important element is choosing an appropriate aiming point. And this is something that pilots forget all the time. And here's why I think they do that. The vast majority of the time when pilots are landing, they're aiming for the runway numbers. And to aim at the numbers, a pilot's typically going to use pitch and power to adjust the position of the aircraft so that when they're on short final and at the appropriate approach speed, the runway numbers are going to be about a third of the way up from the bottom of the windshield. Of course, normally the plane won't land on the numbers. Instead, it's going to float during the flare and it's going to touch down at a point well beyond the numbers. But when pilots are flying a short field approach, the correct aiming point is often not the numbers. But pilots get so used to aiming at the numbers, even when they fly a short field approach, they'll often forget they need to aim elsewhere, and they'll just instinctively aim at the numbers out of habit. And of course, the big question is, how far in front of your intended landing point should you be aiming? And that's going to be totally dependent upon your aircraft type and your approach speed. So you're going to have to do some trial and error in your airplane to determine how far it's going to float during a short field landing, and hence how far in front of your designated landing spot you need to be aiming when you're on final. Of course, if you come up short and the airplane is going to touch down before the desired touchdown point, well, you really should add some power so that your airplane stays in the air until it reaches the designated touchdown point. So that in itself suggests an aiming strategy if you don't have a good idea of how far your aircraft will float. And that is, if you're in doubt as to how far you're going to float, you're better off aiming so that you come up a little bit short and then add power to get to the touchdown point. Because if you aim too far down the runway and pass way beyond your touchdown point, well, there's just nothing you really can do to salvage that short field landing. But if you do have to add power while you're in the flare to get to your touchdown point, you're probably going to need to add more power than you realize you need to add. And that's because when an aircraft is in the flare, it's configured the same way it is during slow flight with full flaps and landing gear down. And to stay level in slow flight, you need a lot of power. For example, in a Cessna 172, it takes around 2,000 RPM to stay level in slow flight. And in the flare, it's going to take a little bit less power because you're going to be in ground effect. But still, it's a lot more power than pilots typically add if they're trying to add just a little tiny bit of power to softly touch down before they land. So remember, if you have to add power to make it out to the touchdown point, it's going to be a lot more power than you probably think it's going to be. So the two big secrets of a short field landing are proper airspeed and choosing an appropriate aiming point. But let's talk a little more about airspeed when you're on final. Assuming you're properly aimed at the runway, I'd suggest you use pitch as a primary way to control your airspeed. So if you're a little fast, you're going to raise the nose slightly, and if you're a little slow, you're going to lower the nose slightly, and then use whatever power it takes to get to the aiming point on the runway. And when you make your power changes, you may find that you also need to simultaneously make a slight pitch change so that your speed remains constant. So, for example, if you're coming up short of the aiming point and you decide to add power, the aircraft may also speed up a little as you add the power. So as you add power, you may want to slightly increase the pitch so that the aircraft doesn't speed up as you add power. And if you decrease power because it looks like you're too high and are going to arrive at someplace beyond your aiming point, lower the nose slightly as you pull power so that the aircraft doesn't slow up. Now, the Airplane Flying Handbook says, quote, care must be taken to avoid excessively low airspeed. If the speed is allowed to become too slow, an increase in pitch and application of full power may only result in a further rate of descent. This occurs when the angle of attack is so great and creating so much drag that the maximum available power is insufficient to overcome it. This is generally referred to as operating in the region of reverse command or operating on the backside of the power curve. When there is doubt regarding the outcome of the approach, make a go around and try again or divert to a more suitable landing area. And the Airplane Flying Handbook also says that after touchdown, the airplane is held in a positive pitch attitude as long as the elevators remain effective. This provides aerodynamic braking to assist in deceleration. Immediately upon touchdown and closing the throttle, appropriate braking is applied to minimize the after-landing roll. The airplane is normally stopped within the shortest possible distance consistent with safety and controllability. Now, here are some common errors in performance of short field approaches and landings. And again, this comes from the Airplane Flying Handbook. 1, failure to allow enough room on final to set up the approach, necessitating an overly steep approach and high sink rate, which, by the way, is why I said that having a longer downwind and a longer final can sometimes be helpful to give you more time to set up properly on final. Number 2, an unstable approach. 3, undue delay in initiating glide path corrections. 4, too low an airspeed on final, resulting in an inability to flare properly and landing hard. 5, too high an airspeed, resulting in floating on roundout. 6, prematurely reducing power to idle on roundout, resulting in a hard landing. 7, touchdown with excessive airspeed. 8, excessive and or unnecessary braking after touchdown. 9, failure to maintain directional control. And 10, failure to recognize and abort a poor approach that cannot be completed safely. Well, so there you have it. 2 secrets to great short field landings. Short field landings work best when you calculate an appropriate short field landing speed and you fly that speed precisely, and when you fly a stable approach that doesn't have a high descent rate, and when you choose an appropriate aiming point that's usually not the runway numbers, which allows you to float out to your target landing point. Coming up next, we're going to have listener feedback and listener questions. We'll be right back. And before we get to listener feedback and questions, just a couple quick thank yous for people who left reviews, first in the Apple Podcast app, formerly known as iTunes. I know that's where most people listen to the show at. Cash Dad said, in part, I use your library of podcasts to keep my mind immersed in aviation facts and speak like a literal hanger rat in the corner, soaking up every word. The total transition, and I think he's talking about getting his IFR, was as much about a culture of professionalism and safety as it was about actual task and standards. And yes, I totally agree with you. Trying to be safe in flying is as much about professionalism as anything else. Also, a review from John James Jones. Thank you very much. He said, awesome podcast. And in our dedicated app for the iPhone and the iPad, Flyin' Fred II, so I'm pretty sure he's a flight instructor, had a lot of nice things to say. This one kind of caught me. He said, Max unselfishly reveals his thinking behind the thinking, presenting concepts in a way that promote true understanding and deep connection to the subject matter. Hadn't thought about thinking behind the thinking, but I will certainly try to continue to do that. And for those folks who are using the dedicated Aviation News Talk app on Android phones, let's see, I want to thank a Google user and also Larry Tabor. Larry is my good friend who I spent many, many trips on going to Mexico, where we took volunteer doctors and dentists, and Larry is one of those volunteer dentists. So thanks so much for your review, Larry. All right, let's go to listener feedback. This first one comes from Edward Varsa, one of our Patreon supporters. He says, just wanted to take a minute to thank you for creating 10 Things Pilots Do That Bug ATC Show. Now, that was episode 84. He says, I thought it was great. Funny side note about turning crosswind. I was taught to turn crosswind at 500-foot AGL and never thought differently until listening to the show. There were many great takeaways, and thank you again. And yes, 500 feet AGL would indeed be the correct altitude if you have an 800-foot traffic pattern, because you're supposed to turn 300 feet below the traffic pattern altitude. And from Chris in Alaska, he also says the same show we just talked about was great. He said, I'll add Brandon's podcast to my list. Please revisit base turn without a clearance and this 300 foot below the pattern thing more often. He says that our class Delta, we use 400 feet AGL, and I did not know we were busting the AIM, the Aeronautical Information Manual. He did follow up later to say that he's had some discussions and that the air traffic control there really wants to get people turned a little bit sooner than it would take to go all the way up to 300 feet below TPL. So I guess, different airports do things a little bit differently. And here's an email from George in Auckland, New Zealand. This came in while I was in Australia, and actually I had thought about going over to New Zealand for a couple of days, but didn't. George says, one thing I'd like to know, many of your guests are CFIs and talk as if you can make a career of teaching. Is that indeed a possibility in the U.S.? I would have loved to make instructing a career, but here it just isn't something you can make a living on. I moved on to the airlines, and while flying an airliner is not to be sneezed at, instruction was probably more where my heart was at. And I wrote back to him, and I said, yes, I know a lot of CFIs who make a living teaching. Most of them specialize in teaching in Cirrus jets or in very high-end general aviation aircraft. And all of these people are independent flight instructors. They don't work for a local flight school. I did say I think that it's probably harder to make a living if you're teaching for a local flight school and teaching, for example, in simpler aircraft such as the 172. And here's an email from Fred in New York. Let me read just a small portion of it. He was talking about ELTs, emergency locator transmitters. He says the 406 megahertz frequency used is actually 2 radios and 1. Along with the 406 megahertz is either a 121.5 megahertz or a 243 megahertz transmitter. And he said that's because the 406 megahertz transmits a data burst, which of course gives your GPS location, and that it only lasts about a quarter of a second long, and it repeats itself every 50 seconds. He said the reason it's paired with the traditional ELT frequency is that you cannot home in on this 406 megahertz signal because it's such a short burst. So when they're trying to track down aircraft, they need a signal that's on more continuously, which is why they're going to home in on the 121.5 or the 243. He said, although finding one is as much an art as a science and the subject that's quite interesting for another day. A hint, low tech is better. Incidentally, if a search party does detect a 406 megahertz transmitter only, it's way more likely in a boat or a backpack than in a plane. This knowledge was helpful when I was assigned to track down a 406 megahertz only transmitter from the air. The transmitter would be active for about 3 hours, then become inactive for about 3 hours. This repeated over quite some time. I put 2 and 2 together and realized it was probably a boat and that it was probably partially sunk. The tide would come in and cover the antenna and then go back out and expose the antenna again. The time of the activity and the inactivity corresponded to the tide near Atlantic City, which is where the signal was coming from. That's just pretty amazing. And he goes on to say, thanks so much for your amazing podcast. It's the best not only in aviation, but among the top in any subject I listen to. And he says, thanks for your books, which I find extremely valuable. He says, as a sort of measure of how valuable your G1000 book is, I've already had it stolen. All right, so thanks so much for all that information, Fred. That's really great. Let's go now to some listener questions. Here's an email that came in from Thomas. He said, appreciate your podcast greatly and appreciate your feedback to a question I sent you last year. I wanted to approach you with a new question, one that I'm not sure where to go for the real answer. From my time in middle school, I'm now in my mid-20s, I have suffered from clinical depression and anxiety and have had to be medicated to counteract these conditions. I'm currently on 2 medications to combat these chemical imbalances. The problem for me comes in the fact that these medications are not something I can be prescribed and be taking with any hope of passing a flight physical. This brings up 2 questions that I have had a hard time answering definitively, and while I don't expect you to have a direct answer either, I know you have a much better idea of what resources exist out there in the GA world than I do. Question 1, what if any solution is there for someone who has a medication limitation according to the FAA? I do completely understand the potential side effects and underlying issues this could create, and that someone dealing with that does not need to be in control of an aircraft. My bigger question is, how does one go about finding an approved medication or alternative method of treatment that does allow them to hold a current medical. Second question, how do you find the right FAA medical examiner for you? He says, I really appreciate your show as a whole and your willingness to discuss mental health as you have previously. I know many pilot friends out there that I suspect suffer from depression or anxiety, but with the current climate of mental health in aviation, are afraid to seek treatment because doing so comes at the apparent cost of losing their aviating privileges, which is often the very outlet they use to escape from the mundane droning of life. Thank you for your time and for the show, Thomas. Well, I wrote back to Thomas that I knew the partial answer to question number 1, but I went ahead and called AOPA to get more detail. And I told him I always encourage people to join AOP if for no other reason, so they can use their 800 number, like I just did, to get to any question answered. Now, they have a separate staff there for medical questions, and I would suggest people with tough medical issues call AOPA first, as they can help you understand and thread the rather complex bureaucracy of getting an FAA medical. When I called, I talked with Gary Crump. Now, he heads up the AOPA medical team, and I frequently see articles by him in AOPA's magazine. He said there are now 4 medications that are approved, and it is possible to get a special issuance FAA medical if you're taking one of those 4 medications, though he cautioned that the process is complex, expensive, and takes a long time. He said it also includes getting a full psychiatric evaluation, and he said that he and his team could walk anyone through the entire process, which I didn't ask him to do for me because I was really looking for just the highlights. He said that you would have to work with a specially trained AME and not one of the regular docs that can issue FAA medicals. And he said that AME has to be part of the HIMS program, that's HIMS, which is Human Intervention and Motivation Study. So in answer to your second question, Thomas, you'll really want to contact AOPA and find out from them who is the closest HIMS program doc in your area. Now, just as background, the HIMS program started in the 1970s for airline pilots who were alcoholics, and I became familiar with the program back in 1975 when I visited my father in an alcohol treatment center and met an airline pilot there named Gus McDonald, who was one of the first pilots treated in that program. Gary tells me that HIMS has since been expanded to address other medical issues, including depression. And so just for reference, here are the 4 approved medications. I'm just going to go ahead and give the brand names because I could never pronounce the other names. They include Prozac, Zoloft, Celexa, and Lexapro. Now, Gary also sent me a link, and I'll include this in our show notes. Essentially, the link is for special issuance certification for depression with antidepressant usage. Thomas, I hope this helps. Thanks so much for the listening to the podcast, and please stay in touch. And here are 2 questions from Russ Irwin, who's one of our Patreon supporters. He says, number 1, MOAs have always been kind of confusing to me. And an MOA, by the way, is a military operations area. You'll see it marked on sectional charts. He says they're scattered all over the western states and cover a lot of airspace. They're not entirely restricted. They have operating hours and talk about contacting, quote, the controlling authority. Are they sort of like Class Charlie? If you're talking, you can enter, or more like Bravo and you need a clearance? He says sometimes an ARTCC is listed. That would be a center frequency, sometimes just a military unit. Should I just avoid them, or is there a way to safely transit them? And he says, number 2, you've spoken of the level button, LVL, on the new Cirrus Perspective Plus Autopilot. He says it's also on the new Garmin GFC 500, but not on the GFC 700 with many G1000 units, including the new NXI. My best guess is the equivalent level button would be pushing heading on the PFD and pushing alt on the GFC 700. Does that result in level flight on the current heading at the current altitude? Let's go to question number 1, military operations area. Wikipedia says a military operations area is airspace established outside of Class A to separate or segregate certain non-hazardous military activities from IFR traffic and to identify for VFR traffic where these activities are conducted. And it's very different from both the Class Charlie, Class Bravo, the other things we've talked about here. With those, you need to be talking with somebody. With an MOA, you're actually allowed to enter it and not talk to anyone. So that might not be the wisest thing to do. And when I go through MOAs, I always like to be talking with a center or approach control or whoever is responsible for that. And you can usually find that by looking on the side of the chart. You'll find the MOA listed there, and usually a frequency. That would be the controlling authority for that MOA. So if they were really going to be doing very hazardous kind of activity, dogfighting and things like that, they wouldn't be doing it in an MOA. They'd be doing it in a restricted area. And there, of course, you do have to have permission to go in if it's hot. You're allowed to go in if it's cold. So I hope that makes it clear for you. You see an MOA, you're welcome to go in. It's wise to talk to people, but it's not required. Now, as for the level button, you suggested that putting it in heading and alt mode would be essentially the same. And you said, would that result in level flight on the current heading at the current altitude? Yes, it would, but that's not the same as what the level button does. First of all, the level button is going to recover from any kind of unusual attitude, and there's no function on the autopilot that's going to do that. Second, when it does finally recover, it does have you in a level attitude on a particular heading, but it's not going to maintain that altitude or that heading over the long term. Over the short term, first couple of minutes, it'll pretty much keep it correct. But as it gets bounced around, it will end up on a slightly different heading, slightly different altitude, which would not be the case if you were in heading mode in altitude hold mode. So what you could do to essentially emulate level mode would be to instead click on roll mode. Now in the GFC 700 autopilot that you mentioned, which is found in all the newer G1000s, to get to roll mode, you push either the heading key or the nav key, doesn't matter which one, and you got to push it either once or twice, kind of depends on what mode it was in when you first started pushing. But if you watch the annunciators, just keep pushing it once or twice until you see ROL. That tells you it's in roll mode, which essentially means keep the wings level, which is what level mode is doing. And then you want to go to your pitch modes and you want to select VS for the vertical speed mode, and you want to set it for 0 feet per minute. So unlike altitude hold mode, which will hold you at a particular altitude, vertical speed 0 will kind of let you float up and float down as you go through updrafts and downdrafts. And these two modes, by the way, are exactly what I use when I'm trying to fly in turbulent areas, and I found this really smooths the ride out a lot. Rather than using heading mode and alt mode, I use roll mode and vertical speed mode with 0 feet per minute set. So hope that helps. Thanks so much for your questions, Russ. And the end of the year is coming up. A lot of people like to try and complete their transactions buying the aircraft before the end of the tax year. If you're thinking about doing that and you're thinking about a Cirrus, please call me today. Be happy to help you out. I can also arrange a free demo flight if you're thinking about a new Cirrus. I work with folks around the world. I'm happy to help you as well, too. And if you were thinking about buying one next year, well, let's start the conversation now. Speaking of conversations, please take a moment to tell your friends about Aviation News Talk. Lots of people hear about the show that way, and hopefully they'll hear about it from you. If you haven't taken our listener survey, go on out to aviationnewstalk.com/survey and give us all your feedback. Until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up. And we'll see you on Friday with all those Black Friday specials.